Imagine being locked in a cell next to a man so dangerous that guards refused to touch his food tray. A man who could kill with nothing but a sharpened piece of metal, or worse, with patience. In America's most secure prisons, there are names that don't just echo, they haunt. Names whispered in the yard, written in incident reports that never see the public, carved into the nightmares of guards who swore never to speak of them again. These are not gang leaders running empires, not drug lords buying loyalty. These are individuals so violent, so uncontrollable, that the US prison system had to invent new rules just to contain them. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on America's most dangerous prisoner, the man the government locked away in silence for decades because anything less would have meant blood on the floors. Thomas Edward Silverstein wasn't born a monster. He grew up in the suburbs of California, raised by a working-class family. But by the late 1970s, he had already slipped into crime burglary, armed robbery, drugs. What set him apart wasn't the crimes themselves.
Silverstein went to prison back in '78 for armed robbery. He was later found guilty of...
It was what he became once the cell door slammed shut. Silverstein joined the Aryan Brotherhood early in his sentence. In prison, gangs are oxygen. They give you protection, identity, power. For him, it became something darker. He didn't just follow orders, he carved out his reputation with violence. The first real shock came in 1980 at USP Marion, Illinois. Then one of the toughest federal prisons in the US, Silverstein was accused of stabbing and killing inmate Danny Atwell. Atwell had refused to help smuggle heroin. That refusal cost him his life. The prison moved Silverstein into tighter confinement, but that only sharpened his rage. 3 years later, he struck again. This time, the victim wasn't another inmate. It was a corrections officer.
Now accused of stabbing a corrections officer, appearing in court just a short time ago on new charges.
Officer Merle Klutz was doing his rounds when Silverstein ambushed him. Accounts vary, but the brutality didn't. Silverstein stabbed him repeatedly with a shank, killing him in cold blood. For the Federal Bureau of Prisons, it was one of the darkest moments in their history. A guard murdered inside a maximum security facility by a man who had already been marked as violent. The system responded with fear and fury. Silverstein was placed under what would later be called no human contact status. That meant exactly what it sounds like. His cell was isolated, meals slid through a slot, exercise alone in a cage, lights on 24 hours a day, no visits from other inmates, no contact with other prisoners, for 36 years. Imagine that. 36 years where the only voices you hear are through steel and glass, where the only touch you feel is shackles, where the only movement is the slow pace of your own footsteps in a concrete box. Guards feared him, not because he could still lash out, though they never ruled that out, but because his presence was a constant reminder that the system could lose control. If one man could kill a corrections officer inside one of the most secure prisons in America, what did that say about their authority? Silverstein became a ghost story. New officers were told about him in training. His name was used like a warning. This is what happens when you let an inmate slip through the cracks. Even when he aged, even when his hair turned white and his body weakened, the legend of Terrible Tom kept the fear alive.
An inmate held in solitary confinement for 35 years, longer than any other federal prisoner, has died.
He died in 2019 at age 67, still in custody, still in isolation. The Bureau of Prisons quietly released a statement. No drama, no headlines. But to those who knew his story, his death marked the end of an era. The end of the man who forced the federal system to redefine what dangerous really meant. What makes Silverstein America's most dangerous prisoner isn't the body count, it's the way he bent the system itself. He forced the government to invent new levels of confinement just to keep him contained. He turned solitary into something darker, something designed for one man alone. And in doing so, he left behind a question that still lingers. When you lock someone away in silence for decades, do you control the danger, or do you just bury it? Before Alcatraz was a tourist attraction, it was the Rock, a place meant to swallow men whole. And in the 1930s and 40s, one of its most infamous residents became a legend. Robert Franklin Stroud, better known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Stroud's story starts long before the birds. Born in 1890 in Seattle, he grew up in poverty, running away at 13. By his 20s, he was drifting, hustling, pimping, living by violence. In 1909, he shot and killed a man in Alaska. The sentence, 12 years in prison. But prison didn't tame him, it sharpened him. By 1916, Stroud was serving time at Leavenworth Penitentiary, and that's where his reputation for violence exploded. When a prison guard punished him for a minor infraction, refusing him a visit, Stroud snapped. In broad daylight, with other inmates watching, he stabbed the guard to death. Brutal, fast, with no hesitation. The message was clear. Robert Stroud was not a man to cross. The murder could have earned him a death sentence, but his mother begged for mercy, and President Woodrow Wilson commuted it to life in prison.
He was then sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison, though not in Alaska, as it wasn't yet a state.
That single act of clemency allowed Stroud to spend decades behind bars and decades building his legend. At Leavenworth, confined for his violence, Stroud discovered a strange obsession: birds. It started with a sick sparrow he nursed back to health in the prison yard. Soon his cell was filled with cages, canaries, finches, sparrows chirping and flapping in a fortress of steel. He taught himself veterinary science, experimented with cures, even wrote books on bird diseases that were published outside. To the public, he became a curiosity, the murderer who became a bird expert. Hollywood would one day turn his story into the movie Birdman of Alcatraz. But inside the prison, the truth was darker. Guards and fellow inmates didn't see a gentle man redeemed by birds. They saw the same violent, manipulative killer, only now surrounded by cages and strange experiments. He brewed medicines from his makeshift lab, traded them with staff and inmates, manipulated people with the same cunning he always had. The birds didn't soften him. They became tools in his control. In 1942, Stroud was transferred to Alcatraz. And here's the irony. Despite his famous nickname, he wasn't allowed to keep birds on the rock. Alcatraz was too strict, too controlled. By then, Stroud was already a middle-aged man, his violence less explosive, but his presence still feared. Guards didn't see him as a quirky old bird lover. They saw him as a man who had murdered one of their own and who could manipulate anyone he touched. At Alcatraz, he lived in isolation for 17 years. He studied, he wrote, he kept his mind sharp, but the violence never fully left his reputation. Guards avoided unnecessary contact. Inmates respected the distance. He wasn't feared because he was still stabbing guards. He was feared because he was proof that time, isolation, even bizarre obsessions couldn't erase the core of who he was, a man willing to kill inside prison walls. Stroud died in 1963 at age 73 after spending 54 years in prison, 42 of them in solitary. To the public, thanks to the movie, he became almost a romantic figure, a misunderstood genius, a bird-loving recluse. To the men who knew him inside, he remained what he always was: unpredictable, dangerous, and deeply feared. What makes Stroud part of America's most dangerous prisoner story isn't just that he killed. It's that he forced the prison system to face its own myth. Rehabilitation, reform, redemption, these words collapsed in his cell. The Birdman didn't become gentle. He became infamous, and even decades later, his shadow still lingers over the legend of Alcatraz. Carl Panzram was the kind of prisoner guards prayed they'd never be assigned to. Born in 1891, he spent most of his life drifting through reform schools, jails, and prisons, but instead of being reformed, every sentence seemed to harden him into something darker. By his own admission, Panzram hated humanity. He wrote in chilling detail that he wanted nothing more than to hurt, destroy, and kill, and he meant it. He confessed to over 20 murders and thousands of burglaries. He admitted to arson, rape, and assault. He wasn't just violent, he was relentless. In 1920, he broke into the home of former U.S. President William H. Taft, stealing a revolver and cash. He used that very gun to commit murders. To Panzram, it wasn't about money. It was about proving that no law, no system, not even the most powerful men in America could stop him. Prison became his battleground. At Leavenworth, he fought guards constantly. He attacked staff, inmates, anyone who crossed his path. In 1929, he murdered a laundry foreman at the prison, bludgeoning him to death with an iron bar. The brutality shocked even hardened guards. It proved what they already knew. Carl Panzram could never be controlled. What made him feared wasn't just the violence, it was his complete lack of remorse. In his prison writings, he declared, "I am here to punish the world." Guards who read his confessions described them as some of the most terrifying words they'd ever seen, not because they were exaggerations, but because they were brutally honest. Panzram didn't care about redemption. He didn't care about survival, he only cared about causing as much pain as possible before the rope finally snapped around his neck, and that rope did come. In 1930, after the murder of the prison foreman, he was sentenced to death. On the gallows at Leavenworth, when asked for final words, he spat defiance. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard! I could hang a dozen men while you're fooling around." That was Karl Panzram until his final breath, unrepentant, venomous, terrifying. For guards, he was a nightmare because he had nothing to lose.
What's it like in Supermax prison? The entry requirements are fairly specialised, so it's hard.
You can punish an inmate with solitary, with loss of privileges, with longer sentences. But what do you do with a man who welcomes death, who sees every day alive as another chance to lash out? Panzram forced the prison system to realize that some men can't be broken. They can only be contained until the day they're executed. His writings, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, became infamous after his death. They revealed a mind consumed by hatred, a man who believed violence was his only purpose. For the world, they were a shocking window into true evil. For those who guarded him, they were confirmation of what they already knew. Karl Panzram wasn't just a dangerous inmate. He was one of the most dangerous men America had ever locked up. In 1996, after nearly 2 decades of hunting, the FBI finally arrested a frail-looking man in a tiny, isolated cabin in Montana. His name was Ted Kaczynski, but the world knew him as the Unabomber. For years, he had terrorized America with a one-man campaign of mail bombings. Universities, airlines, computer stores, anyone he saw as a symbol of modern technological society. His bombs killed 3 people and injured 23 others, many maimed for life. But what made him feared wasn't just the deaths, it was the randomness. You could walk into work, open a package, and never walk out again. That kind of invisible threat left the country on edge. When he was captured, the mask dropped. Kaczynski wasn't a shadowy group or an international terrorist ring. He was a recluse, a mathematics genius who had once taught at UC Berkeley, turned hermit and killer. That paradox, the brilliant professor turned mad bomber, made him a figure of dread and fascination. In prison, the government treated him as one of the highest-risk inmates in the system. He was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a place built to bury the most dangerous prisoners in silence. Terrorists, gang leaders, spies, mass killers, and in one concrete cell, Ted Kaczynski. At ADX, Kaczynski lived under conditions designed for men exactly like him. 23 hours a day in solitary, an hour of exercise in a cage, no contact with other inmates. The prison was meant to strip away influence, to keep men like Kaczynski from spreading their ideology, their orders, or their violence. And yet, even in that silence, his presence cast a shadow. Guards knew his name carried weight outside. Letters poured in from academics, admirers, conspiracy theorists. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a symbol, one that couldn't be allowed to inspire. Every interaction with him came with weight. Handle him too roughly and he becomes a martyr. Handle him too lightly and he becomes a manipulator. Other inmates knew his name too. In the hierarchy of notoriety, Kaczynski was legendary. But he wasn't feared for sudden violence like Karl Panzram or Charles Bronson. He was feared for something subtler, the mind. A man who plotted terror for 17 years, alone, undetected, using nothing but his intellect and his hands. Even in ADX, he never stopped writing. He continued corresponding with people outside, arguing his anti-technology philosophy. Guards watched carefully, monitoring every word, aware that his ideas, not just his bombs, could spread. He wasn't a physical threat anymore, but his mind was. In 2021, after more than 2 decades at ADX, Kaczynski was moved to a medical prison due to declining health. 2 years later, in 2023, he was found dead in his cell in apparent suicide. The news made headlines around the world. The man who once terrified America with invisible bombs had died quietly behind bars.
The man known as the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, has died in prison.
But his legend didn't die. Ted Kaczynski proved that danger doesn't always look like muscle or knives or riots. Sometimes it looks like an old man in a cabin scribbling equations and manifestos. Sometimes the most dangerous prisoner isn't the one who can stab you in the yard, it's the one who can reach out with ideas, words, and fear that transcends walls. That's why even in the silence of ADX Florence, guards still felt his weight, because with men like Kaczynski, prison isn't about punishment, it's about containment, and sometimes containment is the best you can do. Danger in prison is not one shape, it wears different masks. For Thomas Silverstein, it was the cold, unblinking willingness to kill a guard and spend 36 years in total isolation without flinching. For Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, it was the quiet menace of a man who could spend decades in solitary, build an entire world around him, and still be remembered not for redemption, but for the violence that put him there. For Karl Panzram, it was pure hatred, a man who admitted he wanted to burn the world, who attacked without hesitation, and who died with a snarl on his lips. And for Ted Kaczynski, it was the mind proof that ideas, even from the silence of a prison cell, can terrify a nation. So what makes someone America's most dangerous prisoner? It isn't just how many people they killed. It isn't just how violent they were on the outside. It's the way they forced the prison system itself to change around them. Silverstein created an entirely new standard of confinement. Stroud became a cautionary tale of romanticizing monsters. Panzram made guards wonder if some men are simply beyond redemption. Kaczynski showed that even isolation can't contain a dangerous ideology. These men remind us of an unsettling truth. Prison isn't the end of the story. For some, prison is the beginning of something darker. Behind bars, violence doesn't disappear, it mutates. Power doesn't vanish, it adapts. And fear doesn't die, it spreads. Guards know this. Every time they walk the tier, keys jangling, heart pounding, they know some names carry more weight than others. A whisper of Silverstein or Panzram can freeze a conversation. A glance toward the cell of a Kaczynski reminds them that silence itself can be terrifying. For inmates too, these names change the air. You can be surrounded by killers, gang leaders, thieves, and still feel a different kind of tension when one of these men is near. Because they don't just threaten bodies, they threaten the fragile order that prison tries to create. They prove that walls are not enough. And for the rest of us on the outside, these stories force a question. What do we do with people who cannot be controlled? Do we lock them away in silence until they rot? Do we study them, trying to understand how they became what they are? Or do we pretend they're anomalies, monsters who don't reflect anything about us or the systems that shape them? Maybe the scariest part isn't just their crimes, it's the reflection. Silverstein shows what happens when prison violence breeds more violence. Stroud shows how myths can soften monsters until people forget the truth. Panzram shows us the depths of human hatred, stripped of excuses. And Kaczynski shows us that brilliance can curdle into madness, and that ideas can be as dangerous as bullets. There is no single most dangerous prisoner in America. There are many, each dangerous in their own way. But together, their stories reveal something the system would rather we not see. Fear doesn't end at the gates. It thrives inside. And that's why these names still matter. Not because of their legends or the headlines or the Netflix movies, but because they remind us that behind those steel doors, danger isn't locked away. It's alive, waiting, evolving, watching. If this story pulled you into the shadows of America's darkest cells, don't just let it fade when the video ends. Hit the like button so more people see the reality behind the myths. Share this with someone who still thinks prison means safety. And subscribe, because there are more stories waiting darker, stranger, and far more human than anything Hollywood could ever invent. Because America's most dangerous prisoner isn't just a man in a cell. It's the reminder that danger itself doesn't need freedom to survive.